This is John Drabinski, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a Mellon Grant-sponsored series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, late doctoral students, and everyone in between, culture workers and political organizers, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black Studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Today's conversation is with Layla Brown, who teaches in the departments of Anthropology and Sociology and Africana Studies at Northeastern University. Along with scholarly and popular venue essays and critical articles, she was the co-host with Charisse Burden-Stelly of the Last Dope Intellectual podcast, and is currently working with Burden-Stelly on a video podcasted series with Black Liberation Media. In this conversation, we discuss the differences between and intersections of transnational study and Pan-Africanism, anthropological research in a Black Studies context, and the relationship between the production of ideas and the work of liberation struggle. Layla, good afternoon. How are you today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Well, welcome to Black Studies Podcast. I'm really excited you made the time to talk today for a number of reasons. I'll just begin with the fact that you have a professional microphone, so we will have excellent audio on it. I've kind of fallen in love with good audio, so I'm happy about that. But substantially, I'm really interested to hear you talk about the field of Black Studies, your own thoughts on the field, your research in relation to it. You know, I know you do podcast stuff, and I'll link to it in the narrative that comes with each of these when they go live. So I know you think a lot about the relationship between sort of public-facing work, politics, academia, social science, and so forth. So I'm really excited to have you on the series. So welcome, and thank you in advance for your time and thoughtfulness.
Thank you. I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
So we'll get into, of course, thinking about the field of Black Studies and your own research in relation to it. But I wanted to start really with a more personal question, maybe, and ask for you to narrate a little bit of your own journey. You know, what brought you to the study of Black life? What brought you to Black Studies? What got you interested in these things? And always for me, the question also, what sustains you in this kind of work?
So I think like a lot of Black folks, I come from a working class family, but I have a history of educators in my family. So my maternal grandmother, was a high school social studies teacher. My mother was an adult educator. My father was a construction worker, but I also come from a political family. So my father was born and raised in Chicago. My father's older brother is Bob Brown, who is one of the co-founders of the Chicago chapter of the Black Panther Party, who is not often named. But he also, he was from Chicago, around the age of Emmett Till. And so when Emmett Till was murdered, that politicized him, my uncle, not my father. And so he kind of had this trajectory where he went through CORE and SNCC and the Black Panther Party, and then the All African People's Revolutionary Party. And so my parents met as organizers in the All African People's Revolutionary Party in North Carolina as college students. And so I think both, my kind of course to Black Studies comes from both my interest in education as like a career path, but also from my background coming from a political family. As an undergraduate student, so I went to a historically Black college, North Carolina Central University in Durham, North Carolina. I was a history. So initially I went to school thinking I was going to be an English educator. So I was an English education major. And then, I had a course in Spanish, and the professor was like, oh, you seem to have an ear for it. Like, you should consider double majoring, which I did. I had an opportunity to study abroad. I went to Mexico first. That was great. But then I studied abroad in the Dominican Republic. And if anybody knows anything about race and Blackness and identity in the DR, it is a terrible place to be. It is a place that I went to in 2006 and I have never returned to since. But I had two great professors when I was there, Juan Rodriguez, who was an anthropologist, and Blas Jimenez, who was a literary scholar, Afro-Dominican literary scholar. And they taught classes on like Afro-Dominican culture, life, literature, And they started to really like give me some insight into how Blackness was understood in the Dominican Republic. And so when I came back from the DR after having had a really rough time, I was like, I don't think English is really going to work for me. Also, they didn't want to give me my credits. So I was like,
that never hurt. They're never.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I ended up double majoring in history and Spanish. And I actually created for myself an Afro-Latin studies minor in the history department, which is now still offered at the school as a track of study. And so I think I've always come to this interdisciplinarily, right? So even though I had a history degree as an undergraduate and a Spanish major as an undergrad, I was really interested in Black life and culture. When I got ready to go to graduate school, so I did not go to undergrad anticipating going to graduate school at all. Like I said, I was going to be a high school English teacher. But the history department at North Carolina Central University is one of the top HBCU undergraduate programs that sends students on to get PhDs in history, in the country. Yeah. But I knew that I did not want to get a PhD in history because I didn't want to do primarily like archival research. And so I was trying to figure out, okay, well, like, what can I do? And also I graduated in 2009. So amidst the crisis, people were this is a bad time to be trying to get a job. You need to go to graduate school. And like, honestly, like I had done summer research programs. I had done one at UCLA at the Ralph Bunche Institute. I had done one at Ohio State for the Summer Research Opportunities Program. And I was like, okay, what can I do? Like, what can I do in graduate school? But I remember distinctly, I wanted to do Black Studies. That is what I wanted to do. But the chair of my department at the time said, you need to get a PhD in an established discipline. And you can get a job in Black Studies if you want to, but the other way around is more difficult. So I was like, okay. I stumbled upon anthropology. And when I say stumbled, I literally mean stumbled because there were no anthropology courses offered at my undergraduate institution. Because I was at NCCU, there's the UNC consortium system. So you can take one class a semester at the other UNC schools, and Duke included, if that course is not offered at your school. So I took an anthro course. It was actually on like memory, like the politics of memory at UNC. And I was like, hey, okay, this might work. And so I ended up applying to Duke. I applied to some other programs, and I still did apply to Black Studies programs. But I got into Duke. Duke was at home. It was fully paid for. And I was like, so I come from a working class family. So having a full ride was, an easy way in. Oh, yeah. And then trying to figure out like what I was going to do in terms of research. So I remember in 2008, I went to I was in DC randomly, and I was at Howard, and I had stumbled into this conference called What's Up with Venezuela Now? And there were all these Afro-descended people, these Black Venezuelans, talking about how the Bolivarian Revolution had changed their life for the better. And I was already like interested in questions of like race in Latin America because of my experience in the DR. I had done an undergraduate research project on like Black exiles in Cuba, like U.S. Black expats in Cuba. And so I was really kind of thinking about, okay, what are the ways that race is thought about, Blackness in particular, is thought about and constructed differently in the Latin American context. But because of my political upbringing as a Pan-Africanist, I was really interested in questions of left political organizing. So people who understood themselves to be socialists, to be Pan-Africanists. And what did that mean for like, for Black people's lives? Like, what were the concrete examples like in the contemporary moment where Black people were struggling for their freedom? And I saw that in Venezuela. And so that's kind of the direction that I went. And it was really an interesting time because while I was in graduate school, I was, active in the Moral Mondays movement. I had been organizing with the Dream Defenders in Florida. And so initially, as an anthropologist, people want you to like research elsewhere. And so I was doing work in Venezuela, thinking about how Afro-Venezuelans were impacting and pushing the political agenda of the Bolivarian Revolution. But while I was in Venezuela, I kept encountering Black people from the U.S., like just randomly in Venezuela. And I was like, why? Like, why are you here? And people were like, because I keep hearing about the Bolivarian Revolution and I want to hear about it and learn about it for myself. And I remember early on my father saying to me, Venezuela has the potential in your lifetime to be what Cuba was for Black activists in my lifetime. Like, it might be a potential place to go for exile, a place to learn from and about. He was like, so I feel like this is something you need to like keep your eyes on. I'll also say that, you know, when I got to Venezuela, like I had a good experience in Mexico. I had a terrible experience in the Dominican Republic. But when I got to Venezuela, like I had a pretty good experience. Like I was encountering Black people in multiple spaces who were having good experiences. And so I didn't have the same kind of like negative experience with my Blackness that I experienced in the DR. Mm-hmm. And so I also was just kind of happy to physically be in that as a space. Whereas like I had told myself I was never going back to the DR. And I still haven't been back. And so then my questions just, the other thing is that because like Trayvon Martin was killed around this time, Mike Ferguson happened, a lot of people in Venezuela were starting to ask me, okay, well, what are you doing back home? Like what's happening in the US? And so then that kind of made my research question shift from a research question that was just about how are Black people struggling for the terms of their freedom as socialists in Venezuela to what are these sort of transnational flows of information and ideas about how we get free as Black people. Why is it that there was a collective mourning among Black people in the U.S. when Fidel Castro died? Why did Black people collectively mourn in the U.S. when Chavez died? Why are Black folks in Venezuela looking to what's happening in the U.S.? Aside from the fact that obviously like the U.S. is the seat of empire, most people are paying attention to what's going on here. And like, what are the kinds of conversations that are happening? And so I kept finding myself in these kind of international conference spaces where people were clearly very interested in having their respective struggles informed by one another, supported by one another. And so I remember I realized that, you know, this project is about something more. I don't really know what it is. It's still about like social movements, left organizing. It's about Pan-Africanism. But there's a bigger question, you know. At the same time that in the U.S. we had our first, you know, so-called self-identified Black president in Barack Obama under an increasingly neoliberal capitalist, you know, agenda where we are struggling and, you know, the Black Lives Matter movement proliferates under our first Black president. We then have in Venezuela the first self-identified Afro-Indigenous president in Hugo Chavez, where there is this blossoming Afro-descendant movement. And so then it became a comparative project. What do the terms of liberation for Black people look like differently under the first self-identified Black presidents in each respective country in one context where people are struggling for socialism and in another where people are struggling to hold on to the exploitative nature of a neoliberal imperialist regime like the United States. You know, I think my answer kind of to that was always that socialism is what we need to be free. And for us as Black people, my understanding of socialism works through Pan-Africanism, and which for me, that Pan-Africanism is the total liberation and unification of Africa under scientific socialism. But I was also interested in the way that folks were learning from Pan-Africanist traditions in the Venezuelan context. And so, you know, as I've been working on my book project, I remember Gio Mayer specifically, he looked at an early version of my book manuscript, which was based on my dissertation. He was like, I don't really think this is not really a comparative project. He's like, this is not even really about Venezuela. Like Venezuela informs this. But he was like, it seems like this project is really about Pan-Africanism. And I was like, you're right. Like, I think I just never really fully leaned into that because I was in anthropology.
By the way, Gio's a really close friend. I was like, let this end well. Oh, shit.
No, it did.
Sure where I was going. And you said, no, it did. My manuscript.
Yeah, no, it did. I mean, I like still to this day, I really appreciate him just saying, do you want to write a book about Venezuela or do you want to write a book about Pan-Africanism? And I was like, you know, you're right. And I think, but it was the disciplinary training of anthropology that made me think that this project had to be about a place as opposed to a thing, right? You know, a particular phenomena. And I think that is how Black studies has helped me continue to shape the project as I move forward.
Yeah, I mean, look, this conversation's already worth it for that. That was an extremely interesting response. I mean, there's so much in there. I mean, is this interesting? I'm sure it was part of how you thought about the answer, but the way you start with the educator and the increasingly radicalized activists, right? The mother and the uncle, and the way these two things like never really separate for you.
Yeah.
And the way the Dominican Republic, of all places, seems to be sort of where that got catalyzed in a really important form. That is the DR's ugly racial history is not the past. It is the ongoing present in our moment. So that should be noted as you did. Thank you.
I mean, in a very acute way in this moment, because their new minister of like migration or something like a month or two ago just declared that he intended to deport like 10,000 Haitians a week. So
yeah. I know it's a trend in the Americas of the absolute worst kind. But let me come back to the question of Black studies. Very distressing stuff we're talking about. But Black studies, I'm curious to get to hear a little bit about your portrait of Black studies. What is the picture of Black studies that you work with? Because, and I specifically, I guess, want to ask about it in relation to its origin. 50-something years ago, which had a tension built into it. One side of it was intellectual inquiry, where the intellectual life of higher education and the production of ideas and histories and so forth had just completely neglected, if even touched at all, the study of Black life. And Black studies became that place where it's like, look, we're going to study literally Black people. But at the same time, and with the same pressure in the same places at the same moment, was the way that radical Black liberation struggle had really pressed against this distinction between the campus and community, between study and liberation and radical transformation. And Black studies was also a part of that, right? It was also drawn out of that energy and that project and that set of ideas. We're 50-something years out, but we still, I think, struggle with that relationship. And so I'm interested in sort of two questions, which are the same question. What is your portrait of Black studies? How do you imagine the field? And how do you imagine it in relationship to this founding tension?
The thing that always appealed to me about Black studies was because, to me, I feel like Black studies is supposed to be an incubator space for literally how we get free. Like that, to me, I think the questions that we are supposed to be asking as people who are interested in Black people and Black life should fundamentally be questions about freedom. And I think for me, that is why, Afro-pessimism is moving and going in different directions. But I think one of the things that has always frustrated me about what some Afro-pessimists say, which is that it's not prescriptive, is that I find that to be actually antithetical to the Black Studies project. Because I actually do think that Black Studies is supposed to be prescriptive. I don't think Black Studies is, I do think that there's use and value in being able to just think about ideas. But I also think that is always supposed to be to some end. And I do think that end is about, if we understand the predicament of Black life, which is not just about Black life in the U.S. It is about Black life on both sides of the Atlantic and all across the globe, is that we are in a precarious, exploited, enslaved, newly colonized position all over the world. And if we are not using history and literature and political science and whatever else to think about why we are in the predicament that we are in and how we undo that, for me personally, I don't know what the point is. And so that makes me sometimes in a lot of ways kind of indifferent. I won't say antagonistic, but indifferent to the notion of like being fully integrated into the university. Because there's something about the university, particularly in this context, the sort of neoliberal university, that I think is actually really even antithetical to education and knowledge. Like one of the things
that's definitely true.
Yeah. And because one of the things I often
contour in what you're
yes, it does. But because one of the things I often tell my students is that, I remember I finished my PhD at Duke University. I finished my PhD in 2016. I did not get a job my first year. I was married, living at home with my parents, teaching swim lessons for $7.75 an hour with a PhD from Duke for a good year. And I remember telling my students, like, obviously we need to work. We need to feed ourselves. We have to house, we have to clothe and house ourselves or whatever. But if you only think about your education as a means to getting a job, to doing something for somebody else, that is literally not the point. There has to be something that you are invested in through this process for yourself. It can't just be about what skills can you put to work for somebody else to exploit. And so I say that to say there is no one-to-one between your education and your employability in a capitalist society. And I say that because, like, we see this sort of increase in the university where it's like, oh, we want to give students practical skills. Listen, I am a practical skills person. I think we all need practical skills, even those of us who are in the social sciences and humanities. But I don't think we need practical skills to be employed and to be exploited. We need practical skills to be able to do practical things. Like we need to know how to have clean water and do all these other kinds of things. And so I think about the thing that appeals to me about Black Studies is its original impetus, is that there was this original push to say, we need to have people who have the time, the ability, the space to think about our predicament as people and try to figure out how do we work our way out of it. And that's what makes it difficult about doing that in the university, because all of these sort of increasingly like professionalized tasks, like, in the academy, you have to publish a book to get tenure. But books take a long time. It takes a long time. And I'm a person who actually has a lot of resistance to writing. And I think one of the reasons why I've been thinking about this a lot. One of the reasons why I think I have a resistance to writing is because I think what I want to write is ultimately a book about how we get free. And if I don't have the answer to that, then I don't want to just write things. Like, I don't want to just write things because somebody needs to see that my thinking can be quantified and be proven as productive. And so now I write a book that may or may not be useful, that 40 or 50 people may read so that I can get tenure, so that I can have job security, but doesn't actually do the work that I wanted it to do. And that's a tension. Like, that's a real tension for me. I think there are a lot of people who think they have a lot of good things to say and they like to write and do all these things. And that's wonderful and great. But that's not really my relationship to writing. And I think that the more that Black Studies exists inside of the neoliberal academy, it has to perform in the ways the academy expects other disciplines to perform. But I don't think that should be the primary function. And so that is the way that I relate to Black Studies. It is fundamentally, for me, as a Black Studies, as a women's studies scholar also, it is about how do we care for one another? How do we exist? How do we sustain our humanity? How do we, maintain our dignity? How do we really find ways to allow ourselves to be human? And those are, I think, the kind of fundamental things that are important to me about Black Studies that I don't know that always translate into the particularities of the university as a setting, as a structure.
Yeah, I mean, look, across these podcasts, I mean, by the time when this one comes out, it'd be in the mid 70s. Almost every single conversation comes back to this question, like, how do we even think about Black Studies in relation to the university? And like you said, I mean, we all need jobs, right? We all need support to do these kinds of things, and we're lucky to have it. But the question always of what's, it's not a gift, right? It's an exchange in what's asked of us. And when you said it takes forever for a book to come out, I thought you were going to say, because this was on my mind, it also just takes so long for it to come out. It's like my writing, especially if you're thinking about something that contributes to a project of freedom and transformation. It's like, it's hard. That takes 11 months. Like, we need this now. Yeah. Well, let me ask you about your writing, sort of continuing, I think, very much with what you were just talking about. You as you were, describing your own work, you're interested in, things that come out of political theory and cultural history, which I think are really embedded in the kind of anthropology that you're talking about, but also transnational studies or Pan-African inquiry and ideological commitments, which I just think is so important for the field of Black studies. I think this collage just has so much promise in it. So I'm interested to hear you talk a little bit, like thinking about your own work and the field of Black studies. How do you locate that work in the history of Black studies? Like what part of the tradition is it a part of? But also, maybe an and or an or here, what horizons do you see it opening up that the field itself has not really pursued?
I don't know that. I don't think that there's much that the field of Black studies hasn't pursued. I think what has happened more often than not is that there are particular strains and threads that are more easily legible in certain environments. And so things go that way. Like, I think, and this is not at all like any kind of like diss on literature or whatever, but I think like when you were able to like sort of creatively tell stories and like read text in a particular kind of way to come up with certain kinds of analyses, I think there's like a productive tension there that's a little bit different than when you're trying to say like, oh, I'm actually trying to like prescribe something for real here. Like, okay, what do we need to do? And it's not to say that I don't think literature does that, but I think it does it in a different kind of way. And so I think that, in some instances it is easy is not the right word, but I can imagine that if I were trying to envision certain things or read from other texts, that I might not have the same kinds of stress about like what it is that I want to say, because it's like right or wrong, right? For me, I think with Black studies, obviously, so I do a lot of work on Afro-Latin America. And I think that has been very much a part of the conversation from the beginning. But I think, again, the field of Black studies in the U.S. tends to be very U.S.-centric. And for that reason, I often, I don't know, it's weird. Black studies is a place that I find the most home. But I also feel like I'm not really at home in a lot of different disciplines. Like I'm not really at home in Latin American studies because I do Black people in Latin America. I'm not as at home in Black studies in the U.S. because I'm not as preoccupied with the U.S. experience of Blackness. I'm not as at home as an anthropologist because even though Venezuela is a place where I explore, Venezuela could be anything. Like for me, it's not about Venezuela as a site of inquiry. It's about the fact that particular struggles are happening in this moment, right? Even in women's studies, like I am interested in questions of gender and women's and women in particular, but I'm more interested in these sort of bigger political questions and then how women navigate those struggles, right? And so I think that for me, I don't know, I think interdisciplinarity is the only way that I can really approach all of these things, because I don't think any one of these fields does exactly what I needed to do, though I think Black studies does it the most. And I think Black studies does it the most because Black studies is first and foremost most concerned with, like, again, I think the predicament of Black life. But I think in terms of sort of directions, like, I teach an Afro-Latin American studies course. And, I think people know this, but a lot of people don't know this. We think about Black life, right? And we think even Black studies, because of the hegemonic position of the U.S., of English language, of all these kinds of things, Black people make up 13 to 14% of the U.S. population. Through the transatlantic slave trade, I think somewhere between 7 to 9% of enslaved Africans came to the continental United States. 40% went to Brazil. 39% went to the Caribbean, right? And so when we think about when the fact that Black studies in the U.S. is so focused on this U.S. Black experience and does not, and it really, I think, often has to be pushed to think about what Black life is. Because usually, like, if you have a person that does Black Pacific or if you have a person that does Afro-Latin American, they're usually outliers. It's usually a Black studies department is usually overly crowded by folks in the U.S. And then there's also this weird distinction between Black, Africana, African American, African diaspora studies, and African studies. And it's because I think there's also this kind of false dichotomy in studying the experience of enslavement as opposed to colonialism, and I don't think we do the real work to understand them as two sides of the same coin, which I think Jemima Pierre's work actually does really well. Her first book, The Predicament of Blackness, which thinks about the question of race in a place like Ghana, where people often say, okay, well, because everybody's Black, people aren't thinking about questions of race in the same way. And she like turns that on its head. Like that's actually just not true. And so, one of the things I think about Black studies in the U.S. in specific is that I really wanted to just get beyond its U.S. centrism. That is, I think, the main thing that I want. And that is why I'm very adamant about situating my work as Pan-Africanist. And that is why I always use the term or the phrase, I don't use African diaspora. I try not to use Africana, like all these things, like Pan-African, because I am interested in even the notion of Pan-Africanism as we understand it through like somebody like Kwame Nkrumah. Like, yes, he's the first president of Ghana, and is the first president of independent Ghana. He kind of like, leads this cascade of the independence movements. But part of what informs Nkrumah's understandings of the Black world is his 10 years in the U.S., studying at Lincoln University in Pennsylvania, and also studying Marcus Garvey. Like, so at my university last night, we had a Kwanzaa ceremony, and the what do you call it? It's not even the Pan-African flag. What do they call it? Like the Black flag in the U.S. is like red, black, and green. But what a lot of people they often don't make those connections. The Pan-African colors are red, black, green, and gold. And that comes from Marcus Garvey when he says that, Black is for the people, red is for the blood, green is for the land, gold is for the riches. When you look at all of the the post-50s independent African countries, their flags, not all, but many of them have some combination of red, black, green, and gold. And that is because Nkrumah chose those colors for Ghana's flag first. And that is a result of him studying Marcus Garvey. And so even these ideas about Pan-Africanism come from the lived experiences of a Pan-African type of exchange. And I think that's always been it's always been a part of our experience. So I'm not even, I'm not saying that it's not there, but I don't know that we spend enough time really thinking about what it means that our conception of Blackness really should and does go beyond a U.S. Black experience. It's so U.S. focused for me. And that is one thing that I really hope we continue to push, even as folks, I think it is important to understand the particularities of our predicament in the U.S. But like on the question of race, one of the things that really made me interested after I studied abroad in the DR, because people are like, oh, race operates so differently in Latin America. And what I really learned is that it actually doesn't. Both in the U.S. and in the rest of Latin America, there are two different anti-Black eugenicist projects with differing logics. Because of the sort of Protestant religious tradition in the U.S., the eugenicist logic was about separation and purity. Because of the Catholic tradition of mixing that happens in the Spanish, French, and Portuguese-speaking territories, their idea about getting rid of Blackness is to mix together, to mix out Blackness. But they are still both projects that are ultimately about getting rid of Blackness through one means or another. And so this idea that because there is this thematic scale where people can identify as something other than Black or white in between in the Latin American context is not evidence of a lesser degree of anti-Blackness. It's a different way of anti-Blackness operating. But I think that we can't see that if we're not actually looking at the sort of mundane everyday ways that anti-Blackness operates at the same time in these differing contexts. And so that's something that I think is really important that I hope Black Studies continues to pursue.
Yeah, I mean, to what you were saying there, I mean, I've always thought, not that this is a podcast conversation with me, but I've always thought that the people use the word diaspora in the field and related fields a lot. And I've just always felt there's so much at stake in that word. I'm like, for what it's worth, I mean, it's John Drabinski, but when I hear diaspora, I think very much what you say when you say Pan-African. Because for me, there's a sort of national sort of interest or even regional interests of like the United States, the Caribbean. I'm Caribbean studies specialist myself. And I think really emerging, I mean, it's actually very new. in my own professional lifetime, really emergent thing about Afro-Latino. But, these sort of regional or national sort of focuses, and as you say, also African studies, which is its whole sort of independent question, or the sort of old school temple Africology, right? Afrocentrism. But diaspora sort of floats out there, and I'm like, this is actually requires a lot of us. First of all, it requires us to learn a lot of languages, right? If we want to do research across these, but also thinking in these really complicated spaces where something like, as you were saying, anti-Blackness becomes an enigma to be defined rather than just simply a national practice that has a different vocabulary that doesn't translate in the dictionary, and so it must be different, but instead requires a sort of analytic that you're talking about. I have thought in that way, one of the central unresolved questions of Black studies is, what is anti-Blackness?
Yeah. No, and it's really important.
It made the world. So
yes. And I think even I don't know. I haven't looked enough at Black studies programs, but in the same way that I think in and anthropology PhD programs, like one of the not prerequisites but requirements is that you have to learn another language. And I just don't know. I just don't know how we really, really engage the big questions of what it means to be Black and experience the world, if we can only understand that in one language. And I know everybody doesn't have the capacity to learn 5, 6, 7 languages, and that's not an expectation. But I do think that as a bare minimum, those of us who consider ourselves Black studies scholars should be able to engage in more than one language, whether that be reading or whatever.
Look, I'm about to faint with pleasure. Man, this is one of my soapboxes. I did not bring this up, just to be clear, on the podcast, because my students would be like, he always rants about that. Learn a language. I think, so I speak English and Spanish. I've been working on trying to learn Portuguese, and I'm actually teaching a Black France course this summer, and so I'm going to get pushed on my French too. But when I think about the world's Black population, obviously, with all the indigenous languages, the languages that we're communicating in, our colonial languages, but to not be able to read or engage in French, or to not be able to read or engage in Portuguese really leaves out so much of a Black experience. And so if you're only able to read and engage works, and also even and being able to, I think, read and engage in text in that language, right? Because not all translations are good. And that's also something that the more fluent I got in Spanish and I would pay attention, I was like, oh, that's actually not a good translation of that concept. And I think about, especially in, because I do particular work around certain political communities, when I've tried to observe, because I've often been in spaces in Latin America where they are trying to work with 5 different languages at one time. So English, Spanish, French, Portuguese, and Creole. And, I'll try to listen to, and I'm yes, that translates the words, but it's not translating the essence of the concept. Yeah. And I think that really matters. And we can only do that with a particular kind of fluency. And I also think just learning another language, it generates a particular kind of humility that I think that people really does, man.
need to be able to do.
Me and Lima talking to human rights lawyers. I did a project on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I gave up for a long story, but talking with human rights lawyers, my really confident Spanish, and they get in a taxi and I'm like, I can't even tell them how to get back to So talk about humility. There I am lost in the street, whereas really I just had this really edifying conversation where I felt like a smart bilingual person.
And that's the thing, right? It's this, to have this experience where you think of yourself as smart and you think of yourself as being able to articulate ideas, and you're trying to communicate with someone and you realize I can say some words, but you're not really getting what I really want to say. That's what I mean about a humbling experience.
Yeah.
It's not even about taking you down a peg. It's okay, do you know what it really means to really try to communicate with a person and not be able to be your full self? You lose parts of yourself when you're not able to engage in humor and sarcasm and wit and all of these other kinds of things that are really important parts of the human experience. And so I think that, like, in general, I just advocate that. Like, I hope that most of us think that there is something important about speaking at least more than one language.
And I always tell students, because I, yell at them to do it, but I'm also like, just have a sense of humor about yourself, I mean, it's, we find it like charming when people struggle and, I mean, if we're not like xenophobes, right? Struggle in a second language, that's just you, I mean, they're not like,
yes.
But also, I think it's also fun. I mean, it's something about language. I think it's a little bit like math, where people have a pre-fear. I mean, I do definitely, like, I've thought about picking up another language, and whether Portuguese, or if I could find a good like way of learning Martinican Creole. But I just I encounter that like fear. Like, there's something about language. I don't know, it gives a particular kind of anxiety, but it shouldn't, because I mean, it's just like you said, it's just trying to access other ways that people are themselves. And if we're interested in people, it should be a pleasure. But yeah. So hopefully this portion of the podcast, minute 37:30 to 39:15, has gotten everybody into Duolingo or Lingo or whatever other software we can hijack for it. Well, let me ask you this as sort of, and it's related to this question that I had about sort of your work in relation to the past of Black studies and the future. But sort of more broadly, sort of observing the field, what do you think that Black studies as a field has done particularly well? And what do you think it has not done particularly well?
What has it done particularly well and not well? I mean, I do think that, okay, so what was that? It was, I guess, 2014, 2015, like when the Mizzou stuff, like, I think this was like in the aftermath of Ferguson. Yeah. And there was this moment when and I think, I guess 2020 was like another moment like that also. But there was this moment where, Black student organizations were thinking about what it means, particularly at like predominantly white institutions. And I think that's also another interesting dynamic, because I don't know how many Spelman does, but I don't know how many HBCUs have like a particular Black studies program. I think it's more implied that because we are a Black place and because we have like a Black student body, that we will engage in these questions. And I am the product of an HBCU, and I love them, but I also know that there are many ways in which many HBCUs can be quite conservative and sort of limiting in terms of a lot of those fields. And Black studies is one that's not widely available at HBCUs.
Yeah. Howard has one.
Yeah, Howard has one. But I remember working with students when I was at Duke who were like going back into the archive, and they were trying to come up with like their, demands. And I think there was this moment where we started seeing all of these Black students across the country at these white institutions in 2014, 2015, who were coming up with a list of demands for the universities that were literally almost verbatim the same list of demands that the Black student organizations had in the 60s and 70s. And I don't know, and maybe that's something that Black studies hasn't done well, right? That has done particularly bad. Is like, as much as we talk about the importance of the archive, even like the personal sort of familial archives, I don't know that we engage them in the ways that we should beyond like our academic research and like our academic publications. Because to me, it was just really telling in that moment that students had no idea that the things that they were asking for were the very things that were demanded 50 years early. And then what does that mean, that you're asking for the same things that many people got, but then that were, retrenched, that were walked back? I think one of the examples of this is that because, I mentioned that I grew up with my parents organizing in the All African People's Revolutionary Party, and Howard University was a place where they did a lot of organizing. We organized African Liberation Day every year in DC. And I remember like none of us had any official ties to Howard, but we could go on campus and be in the Blackburn, Blackburn auditorium, or just take a classroom, right? And that because of the way that student protest organizing really kind of opened up all these possibilities for Black folks, there has been a backlash or a blacklash, if you will, that now there are all these like highly securitized ways of being on campus to have a program. You have to have insurance and security and all these things. But they are particularly ways of exacerbating the distinction between town and gown, right? There are ways that these institutions in the past had opened themselves up more to a public and are increasingly shut down from a public now. And I remember my dad just saying this, was like, we did not have to do all of these things to be able to like go onto campus and use a space, even though Howard is technically a private institution. Like it wasn't a thing. My dad came from Chicago in the 70s to go to Shaw because that's where SNCC was started. My mother went to NC State. And one of the things that he told me, so there were a couple different things, but he was made an honorary member of the General Union of Palestinian Students as an activist with Shaw. But another thing is like they had a Black student organizing group consortium across the universities. And one thing that they would do is that they would have a school like Duke, UNC, or NC State pay to bring a speaker like Kwame Ture, like Malcolm X. Like Duke, UNC, or NC State would pay because they had the money. And then they would then continue their speaking tour and speak at Shaw, a St. Aug, a Central, or whatever, because they didn't have those resources. And so there was really this way, I think there was this ethic of understanding that these resources had to be shared, both with the community and with other folks, at other institutions who didn't have the same types. And so I don't know that enough of that is really worked into the way we teach students about what is the purpose of Black studies? Why are you here? I think we struggle for a lot of students because, this is something I was talking to the director of our program about just last night at the Kwanzaa thing. A lot of students, particularly, African immigrant students, want professional tracks, right? Which is fine. You want to be a doctor, you want to be a lawyer, whatever. But they've really been taught that there's no use or no value in something like a Black studies. Like that's just like a feel good kind of thing. And so, I want us to do better at making it clear of why, no matter what thing you might be interested in doing in life, that there's value in understanding how this can contribute to that. And so I tell my students all the time, I want a nursing student in my classroom. I want an architecture student in my classroom because I want you to think about all of the ways that inequality and anti-Blackness are deeply ingrained and embedded in our society. And I don't think that your disciplines are asking you to ask those types of questions. And things like Black studies, ethnic studies, women's studies are asking you to think about, why should you not use your engineering degree to go work for Lockheed Martin? But the engineering department is going to tell you, you need a job, go work for Lockheed Martin. It's great. Do you really want to put your education to work for the benefit of creating weapons of mass destruction and destroying human life? And the thing is, what I find with a lot of students is that they don't even know to ask that question. So it's different. Like if exactly. The really hard part. It's like if you decide that you don't care about the answer to that question, I can't do it. That's you. But if you don't even know to ask that question, that's on us. Like we have to make our students know that they need to even ask those questions. And so I think that's probably like more than enough in terms of what I think Black Studies has not done well. But I think the one thing I will say, I think it does well though. I do think though, at least intellectually, this process of valuing different ways of knowing, right? Which I think I both attribute to Black studies and women's studies, is that knowing that, like, our grandmothers and aunties. My dad has boxes upon boxes of like organizational memos and like these. When we talk about these home archives, right? Yeah. That we've kept. But also even like oral traditions, like being able to understand that the reasons why we know things are not just because we come to know them through school. And I think that's also probably one of the reasons why for me with Black Studies wasn't as transformational for me, is because I felt like I was already like I grew up kind of inculcated in a kind of Black Studies epistemology, like a way of being, because that was how my parents were. I think for me, women's studies was actually very transformational because I hadn't thought as much about questions of gender until I got to graduate school in ways that I was always thinking about race and anti-Blackness before I got to the academy. And so I do think that the valuing the sort of differential differing epistemologies and understanding how that contributes to our ways of being in the world, I think is something that Black Studies has definitely offered in a particularly positive way to the world.
Yeah, no, I love that response. There's like so much to think about in there. So I'm really glad we had that on recorded. I mean, I think people listening, there's really a lot in there to think about, right? About the, that vision of education you had, with the students, because I really responded to that. I mean, people can't see, but, I've like physically really responded when you said, students often don't even know to ask this question about working for Lockheed Martin or similar kind of endeavor. And that's so painful to me, but it's also, for me, a window into, because Black Studies is part of an educational project. I mean, when you said I was inculcated, right, that's one way of saying that is I was educated to be a Black Studies person, like from birth.
Yeah.
Right. And so, I mean, education is about, we get a window into what we think about education and how it's about the cultivation of a certain kind of person. Yep. Right. A certain kind of consciousness, a certain kind of bearing on the world and in the world and the understanding how the world bears on us. But if we don't even get there, I think Black Studies does that. And I always tell one thing I tell them lots of things about this when they're like, why is Black Studies important? And I always say, are they or are they not trying to get rid of us? And they're like, oh, definitely trying to get rid of us. I said, man, no one is ever trying to get rid of something that's not important. I mean, there's garbage and people get rid of garbage. But people don't have passion about garbage. Yes. People are just like, yeah, get it out. But people have passion about the thing that means something, but it means the wrong thing. So you just need to not ask, does it mean the right or does it mean anything? And ask, does it mean something I think is right or does it mean something I'm wrong? And the fact that you're in my third class means you think it means something right.
Exactly.
But also that moment then when they're going to encounter their own, aspirations, Lockheed Martin, Citibank, whatever kind of predatory, weapon of mass destruction, whether a bomb or a finance portfolio. Yep. Getting people to be a certain kind of person in relation to that. It takes me back to my undergraduate was at a Jesuit institution, and they always talked about educating the whole person. And there are a few things that if people said, if I was ever a guest on this, right, how did you get into Black Studies? There's lots of various things, but one would be it's been the only place I've actually felt like that vision of educating the whole person was actually happening. And that in itself, because I am an educator first and foremost, as my own personal identity, it's hard to find places dedicated to. But you know what? Women and gender studies is one of those.
It is.
The fact that you bring these into contact is so important, or sort of like, getting a similar lesson, but maybe in a different way for, in terms of your own personal history. I think that's really revealing about what gender and race as ways of thinking about the foundations of an education rather than a bell and whistle on something else.
It is. I mean, I've always kind of done this, but I started doing it in a very intentional way at Northeastern. So in the past 3 years, but I don't do traditional grading. So I do like labor-based grading. And one of the reasons why I do that for a lot of reasons. I do that because of, I was a Black person with a particular kind of radical politics, not Christian, growing up in the South. So I already just had all kinds of antagonisms in school. And so one thing that I really wanted my students to be able to do is to be able to engage critically without being obsessed with what that means for their grade. And so, I'll tell them like, you can present ideas that I disagree with and I can rip them to shreds and I can still give you credit for the work that you did. And I'm actually fundamentally unconcerned with your grade. Like, I actually don't care what your grade is. Like, you care what your grade is because you need these markers. But I also became really aware of this through my own educational path. Like, I remember I went to high school in North Carolina, and I went to a high school that had like a very extensive international baccalaureate program, advanced placement program. And it was a school that was my neighborhood school, but it was a magnet school. And so like I would ride the bus to school with my Black neighborhood friends and I would never see them in school. I would never, because I was in AP International Baccalaureate program. And but then when we would talk about the different types of work that they would do, like I just remember in my classes, even in high school, like I never had like a fill in the blank test. I never had these very like carceral, punitive ways of being evaluated that my classmates did. And that created a different kind of environment. Like I remember my English and history class were team taught when I was in high school. And so that like there's already presenting students with like the way that knowledge should work and work together and how you answer and create, like it creates different kinds of ways of relating to it than when I have to memorize this thing for this grade. I don't care. And also like we live in a world where, with the exception of like maybe if you're in surgery, at what point are you going to be in a moment where you're not going to be able to reference something else or someone? I'm not asking you to like sit and tell me what you can just spew out from your head. I want you to go to the text. I want you to talk to your classmates. Like one of the extra labor assignments that I allow my students to do, I was like, whatever assignment you've been assigned in class, I want you to do it with a classmate. And then I want you to write a second paper reflecting on what having done it with someone else gave you as opposed to doing it by yourself. And even just like that, right? Like it creates, like I have found that it's created community in my classrooms in ways that like I don't think many people care about. Like even just basic things. I tell my students, like, I expect by the 4th week of class, you're not pointing to your classmate and being like, tell me your name again, or her over there. Like, no, you need to know who one another are because you are in community with one another. And it matters that you all are sharing ideas. And then I get all this feedback from them that like, oh, like, 4 or 5 years later, we still hang out together. I still like, we do very different things. We have a group chat for the classroom, and those things are really important to me. And I think that comes from, my background. Like the only jobs I've ever had have been educating in some way. Like even as a teenager, I taught swim lessons. I coached swim teams. Like I never worked like in retail or fast food or any of those kinds of jobs. And I think, because of my parents, they always pushed me towards those types of things that required me to deal with people in a particular kind of way. And so that's also how I approach the classroom. And so when you said that first and foremost, you're an educator, that's something that really appeals to me, because that's how I see myself. But I also know that the academy doesn't always value that.
Oh, that's true. Yeah. No, even though it would not exist without teachers and students, but whatever. One of the many like cruel ironies of the place. But I mean, I just have to say, I mean, so much, if there's like this thread that's come through and sort of had for me, a really compelling moment here is this is like Black Studies lived as a classroom event. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right? It's and it is something about the principles and commitments and prescriptions of Black Studies around community, around transformation, around valuing labor. I mean, just to use the vocabulary you had around grading, valuing labor and community at the same time. I mean, I love that as a way of Black Studies playing out in the classroom. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you for that. I'm going to be thinking about this over the weekend. I love this. Well, let me ask you a last question, which is, in the context of Black Studies, obviously is the thematic of the podcast. What is the issue you think we should all be thinking about? Or what is the question you think we should all be asking?
How do we smash capitalism? Honestly, again, if I believe my own analysis and I say that Black Studies is about the question of how we become free, and if I believe, as I do and other people agree, that the fundamental economic system that we live under is the economic system that we live under is fundamentally exploitative, then the question is, how do we create a world without that fundamentally exploitative economic system? And for me, that is getting rid of capitalism. And I think that now I don't believe that, because I do believe that racism, sexism, other forms of discrimination have taken on their own lives, I do not believe that just getting rid of capitalism will solve the problems of racism, although I think it will alleviate a lot of pressure. In fact, that is actually one of the reasons why I chose Venezuela, because I remember Chavez saying kind of early on he had this conversation with Castro, and Castro basically told him that, like, we made a mistake. Like, at the Communist Party, like, not allowing, the Communist Party didn't allow organization on the basis of race because they felt like it would be further divisive. And this has been true of sort of the white left too. Like, this is one of the reasons why so many Black communists sort of left the Communist Party, because they weren't dealing with the question of race in the way that they needed to. So I do not believe that just getting rid of capitalism will solve all of the problems, but I do think it is a necessary step that will allow us to deconstruct a lot of the other ways in which exploitation and dehumanization occurs. And I think it's a fundamental step. So I don't, I just, Black studies in the service of empire, Black studies in the service of finance bros, Black studies in the service of, just further exploitation is I don't know if I was gonna say it's a mind fuck. If you need to edit that out, you can. But that for me, like, it just, yeah. But it's just like, it's the antithesis of what it is for me. And so I think that is the fundamental question that I think we need to be exploring, that has to do with inequality, and that all of these other forms of inequality sort of stem from.
I love that. It's a fantastic place to end. For what it's worth, totally agree. But yeah, so that's a great place to end, and it ends with, I think, a really provocative, complex thing to ask us, for all of us listening, me talking with you, ask ourselves, like, how does this impact how we think, how we act, how we teach, how we write? But it's also a continuation of a series of really, really interesting things in this conversation. And I just appreciate your time, Layla, but I really appreciate that, you really brought so many interesting things to this series. And it's going to be a really important part of the series because you were thoughtful across this now about an hour. And I really appreciate that. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I really enjoyed the conversation, and I look forward to just, staying in contact and seeing where it goes and how people receive it.
Absolutely. All right. Well, you have a good rest of your day.
Thank you. You too.
All right. Bye-bye.